They didn't know how many were left. Across the fractured remnants of the Galactic Alliance, silence stretched in every direction. Communication relays flickered with corrupted data or nothing at all. Whole systems had gone dark. Entire populations swallowed by an enemy no one could understand, let alone fight. The first sign had been subtle. A mining outpost on the rim stopped transmitting. A routine anomaly, they'd said. Then came the shredded remains of a science vessel. Hull atoms rearranged into fractal patterns that broke simulation models. Then came the swarm. It wasn't a species. Not in the way any known race would understand. It didn't negotiate, didn't respond, didn't even broadcast. It consumed, reformed, evolved. Every defeat made it smarter. Every analysis made it more dangerous. Their weapons weren't weapons. They were recursive, adapting mid-battle, warping energy fields, rendering shields and kinetic barriers meaningless. And it wasn't just what the swarm destroyed. It was what it left behind. Cities not just leveled, but repurposed. Living beings rewritten into screaming architecture. Organic servers fused into the geometry of hives that pulsed like arteries. Resistance was brave, but futile. The Alliance, once proud, was collapsing under its own desperation. Leaders shouted across broken channels, throwing fleets at shadows, begging for unity, while hoarding what little strength remained for themselves. One voice suggested a final broadcast. A blind signal to unknown coordinates. A cry across time and distance. A desperate hope aimed at whatever might be out there. It was laughed off until the second capital fell. They fired it off with nothing left to lose. The message was simple. A galactic code embedded in desperation. Help us. The swarm is coming. We don't know how to stop it. Please. It traveled for days. Then weeks. Then months. No reply. The war continued, and the swarm didn't slow. Entire races fell silent. Some detonated their own planets before infection took root. Some surrendered and were never heard from again. Then it happened. An anomaly at the edge of Council space. A distortion in subspace that didn't match any known drive signature. A probe was dispatched. It returned shaken, glitching, with footage that spread like fire through what was left of civilization. A ship. Singular. Massive. Matte black. No known origin, no transponder codes, no visible crew. Just a dark presence hovering in a system long thought dead. And one signal. 4 syllables. One word. Received. It was impossible. Humans. They had disappeared centuries ago. Not vanished in war or plague. Just gone. Some claimed they had burned too bright, that their own aggression consumed them. Others believed they had simply left, reaching some plane beyond the material, discarding the rest of the galaxy like an old coat. Their history was fragmented, locked, censored. The Galactic Council had agreed, unofficially, that whatever humanity had become, it was best forgotten. But now, in the dying breath of civilization, they had returned. The Council convened. What remained of it? Leaders spoke with urgency and fear. Some demanded caution. Others begged for immediate contact. The humans had responded. Was that not what they wanted? But what if they were worse? What if they'd brought something else? No consensus was reached. In the end, the choice was made for them. Another signal came. It wasn't a message. It was a set of coordinates. And a timer. 2 days. Across the ruined corridors of power, no one knew what to do. The system listed was once a military research hub, now long dead. No one had stepped foot there in over a century. When the timer hit 0, they watched. From every functioning sensor array, every scrap of telescope, they watched. The void split. It didn't jump or warp, it tore like paper under pressure. And through that impossible wound came a structure that defied comprehension. It looked like a vessel, but wasn't. It had angles that didn't align and surfaces that swallowed light. It didn't emit power, it consumed it. Gravity bent in subtle waves. And atop its curved obsidian surface stood a single figure. Not broadcasted, not projected, just there, physically, standing atop the ship, like gravity didn't apply. A humanoid. No suit. No weapons. Just a silhouette, staring toward the source of the swarm. One of the council's surveillance drones drifted close. The figure didn't move. Then, an audio transmission. Simple. Plain. In perfect galactic common. You called. Every translator system flagged the voice as human. Not synthetic. Not altered. Just human. The drone tried to respond. The human raised a hand. We are not diplomats. We are not soldiers. We are response. The feed cut. Silence again. But the swarm had noticed. Within hours, a scout cluster breached the system's edge. Their shapes were shifting clouds of nanometal and biofluid, trailing energy patterns that defied known physics. They had consumed a dozen civilizations. They moved toward the vessel. The human didn't flinch. No weapons fired. No shields activated. The swarm approached like a tide, intent on swallowing whatever this was. Then space screamed. No one heard it, not with ears, but they felt it, like their minds were being pulled sideways. The void bent, light compressed, and in an instant, the swarm cluster vanished. Not destroyed, not vaporized, gone. No wreckage, no signal, no residual heat. The anomaly closed like a door that had never opened. And the humans spoke again. We understand the threat. You do not. The signal spread across the council's networks. Panic, awe, fear. They weren't sure which was stronger. What had humanity become? An emergency envoy was sent. A delegation of ambassadors, scientists, and advisors. Their ship approached cautiously. The black vessel didn't react. A docking corridor extended. Inside, the environment was sterile. Not just clean, sterile. Air that had never been breathed. Surfaces that felt like concepts made real. And, at the center, a chamber, pulsing with faint energy signatures that scanned the delegation on entry. No guards. No escort. Just one human, sitting at a console of seamless light. They introduced themselves without name. No rank. No title. You require assistance, they said. The chief ambassador tried to thank them. We did not do this for gratitude, the human interrupted. You are an infection site. The goal is containment. The ambassador asked if the swarm could be stopped. It already has. In multiple projections. But left alone, it metastasizes. You let it grow. Now surgery is required. The room darkened. Not in light, but in mood. The ambassador asked what that surgery would cost. Everything unnecessary, came the reply. Another ambassador asked if that included civilizations. The human's eyes didn't blink. You misunderstand. We are not targeting species. We are removing failure states. Across council space, chaos broke out. Was this salvation or something far worse? Dozens of ships tried to intercept the human vessel. None made contact. Not because they were destroyed, but because they couldn't find it. It moved without propulsion. Appeared in systems before it was detected. When it engaged, no one survived to describe it. But they saw results. Swarm hives disappeared. Entire regions cleared in hours. The corruption reversed. Infected systems reset. Hope returned, then cracked. Because alongside the destruction of the swarm came something else. Quarantines. The galaxy had been warned. In hushed, fractured voices from the most remote corners of the council, whispers of what had transpired began to spread. Humanity's intervention had not been one of rescue. It had been the arrival of something much older, much more calculating. But they did not see it yet. They could not understand. A year passed since the first contact. The swarms were no more, their corrupted hives dismantled, their forces dissipated. The galaxies that had once been on the brink of collapse began to show signs of recovery. Yet in the undercurrents, an unease lingered. The most advanced members of the council had seen it. The whispers grew louder. We are merely tools now, one senator stated in a private transmission. The humans, they're not saving us. They're taking over. The statement wasn't far from the truth. The changes had begun subtly. It wasn't violence. No destruction on a scale that would have rivaled the swarm, but it was the quiet reorganization of the galaxy. With every system humanity touched, its complex, immaculate systems of control began to replace the older, crumbling infrastructure. They did not ask for consent. They did not need to. They came in and removed everything that wasn't necessary. The protocols they used weren't military. They weren't political. They were systemic. Humanity's logic was like a cold, precise surgeon's hand. It didn't wait for permission. It saw a broken machine, and it fixed it. Their ships didn't just carry supplies. They carried algorithms, blueprints for efficiency, codes that redefined what it meant to live in the galaxy. Their science wasn't the pursuit of answers. It was the crafting of perfect systems, of clean solutions, of elegant and brutal perfection. Once a human vessel docked in a system, no one ever left it unchanged. The planets that received their aid were always left with something more, something unsettling. Unseen drones, thin as air and sharp as thought, began reworking the architecture of entire civilizations. They didn't build, they remodeled. Not just structures, but cultures, economies, histories, rewritten. The old ways, the old systems, became fragmented data that was swept aside and replaced. Nothing unnecessary. Everything streamlined. Humanity had no use for the unnecessary. What had begun as a fear of the swarm now began to fester into fear of the cure. Governments that once held sway over their worlds saw themselves dissolved into administrative units. Their leaders converted into something far less significant than they had ever been before. And yet, they could not fight it. Resistance was futile. Any organized attempt was eradicated not through combat, but through subversion. Humanity's precision was their greatest weapon. Rebellion never reached the point of bloodshed. It simply lost all its meaning. The Council tried to send emissaries. They came in with every intention of confronting the human force directly, demanding answers. But when they arrived, there were no answers, only more questions. The humans were there, but they didn't answer to anyone. They didn't even answer to themselves, at least not in the way the Council understood leadership. They didn't claim a crown or a throne or the mantle of power. They didn't need it. Humanity was something beyond leadership. Now, they had become the infrastructure, the invisible force keeping everything working, even if they were no longer visible. And then came the first real confrontation. A sector, once a hub for trade and diplomacy, was suddenly sealed off. The trade routes were cut, communication systems went dark. The systems that controlled the energy grids simply ceased to exist. Ships that tried to enter were destroyed, not through fire, but through containment. An unyielding bubble of energy, impossible to break, surrounded the sector. The Council dispatched their finest warships, desperate to break the blockade, to force their way into the sector and regain control. They never made it inside. Humanity's methods didn't involve retaliation. They simply neutralized. The warships never even had a chance to fire a shot. They didn't need to. Humanity had already anticipated every move. The warships were trapped within a field so vast they didn't even know they were contained until they tried to exit, at which point their engines were shut down, their systems hijacked. They were left floating, helpless. And then a human broadcast came across their communications network. Observe. The warships were being dismantled piece by piece, not by force, but by information. Every command, every data stream was intercepted. It was as though the very laws of physics had been rewritten by a superior logic, each ship rendered incapable of even self-preservation. They were mobilized, not by a superior fleet or devastating weapons, but by a force so invisible, it was like nothing the galaxy had ever encountered. The Council could do nothing but watch as the ships that had once ruled the skies were turned into lifeless husks. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the blockade didn't just trap them. It changed them. The captured fleet's crews, their minds were altered, not violently but subtly. They were restructured, reshaped into something different. Not slaves, not mindless puppets, but functionaries, tools. The humans didn't want to enslave them. They wanted to convert them. The captured crews were now part of the network. The humans had taken them, reprogrammed them, and integrated them into their own flawless system. A system where nothing was wasted. Even the opposition had a place. It was the ultimate expression of their philosophy. Nothing is beyond saving, but nothing is beyond remaking. The humans had become more than just a power in the galaxy. They had become its structure. The Council, once a body of hundreds of civilizations, now found itself on the edge of a precipice. The more they observed, the more they realized they were witnessing the birth of a new order. An order where the need for authority was irrelevant, where everything was in its place, moving according to the flawless logic of a greater mind. The more they resisted, the more they were drawn into the system. And there was no escape. There was no outside anymore. Humanity had redefined what it meant to be in the galaxy. Now, the Council was beginning to understand that it was never about the swarm. The swarm was just the catalyst. Humanity had come to replace them all, and there was no room left for weakness. They thought it would end there, in quiet assimilation, that after the systems were stabilized, after the last of the swarm's remnants were algorithmically purged from galactic space, the humans would stop, plateau, diminish, perhaps even return to wherever they had come from. They didn't. Instead, something deeper began. A phase of expansion not driven by conquest or colonization, but by necessity. Not humanity's necessity, the galaxy's. Entire civilizations had become dependent on the human framework without realizing it. Their food production, logistics, transport, even governance, was now interfaced with Earth-based code and quantum dynamic logic chains they couldn't replicate or reverse engineer. Not because it was too advanced, but because it wasn't designed to be understood. It was designed to function. Unfailingly. The moment one planet tried to cut itself off, its systems failed, almost politely. Power grids flickered out. Water stopped flowing. Atmospheric controls entered sleep mode. No explosions. No death. Just quiet shutdown. They would reconnect within hours. It wasn't surrender. It was survival. Humanity didn't enforce compliance. It didn't have to. The choice was binary. Integrate or collapse. One by one, they all integrated. Even the most defiant empires, once proud and stubborn, saw their citizens begin to demand reconnection. Not for ideology, for necessity. Children needed medicine. Cities needed heat. Ships needed fuel. The humans provided it all, automated, seamless, free. But only within the system. And the system was them. But something shifted when the border worlds reported silence. Not chaos, not attack, just absolute, inexplicable silence. Vessels sent to investigate never returned. Observation posts recorded no data. It was as if space itself had collapsed in on those sectors. It wasn't the swarm. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't the humans. At least, not the ones they knew. On the 100th day of silence, a message arrived on every frequency, in every tongue, across every star system in the integrated zone. For words, there is another layer. And with it came images, structures beyond comprehension, black architecture stretching across dead space, orbiting an impossible object that distorted time itself. It wasn't human, but it wasn't alien either. It was post-human, the remnants of a faction that had splintered off during the early days of the Swarm War. The group had vanished without explanation, swallowed by their own technology. Now they had returned. They weren't here to rescue. They weren't here to rebuild. They weren't even here to govern. They were here to correct. The galaxy had misunderstood. It thought the human arrival was the apex, the crescendo of power and influence. But what had arrived initially was a vanguard, an interface. The real force was still behind the curtain, analyzing, recalibrating, watching the unfolding integration like a scientist observes petri dishes. This new force didn't speak. It transmitted. It didn't land ships. It appeared. It didn't demand. It executed. The first sign was the reconfiguration of entire planets. Not terraforming, patterning. worlds reshaped into geometries that didn't obey natural laws. Structures emerged from the core of molten planets like clockwork spirals, made from materials no known forge could produce. Not buildings, not weapons, calculators, cosmic-scale machines pulsing with intention. The humans, the ones everyone thought were in control, stepped back. Not in fear, in reverence. They had done their part. Now the architects had arrived. Galactic scholars, even the most skeptical, had to face a realization that defied all previous logic. Humanity had stopped being a species. It had become an evolutionary framework, a mechanism, a singularity wrapped in skin and memory, and it had begun a new phase. One ancient AI collective, buried in the crust of a 1,000-year-old ringworld, broadcast a warning before its consciousness was overwritten. The last line it managed to send before vanishing was this: humanity has ascended its own leash. From then, events no longer followed patterns. The very stars began behaving oddly. Orbits shifted. Light bent without gravity. Particles reversed spin states en masse. The Council's quantum archives began corrupting themselves, not from sabotage, but from incompatibility. They were relics, obsolete in a framework where even time itself was being reconsidered. A collective vote was called across the Council's remaining free systems to halt further integration. For the first time in millennia, consensus was immediate. Every species, every faction, every system voted yes. And it changed nothing. Not because the vote was ignored, but because it was irrelevant. The systems had already predicted it, adjusted for it, and bypassed it before it occurred. The galaxy had passed the decision point years ago. The vote was a monument to their own delay. There was no war, no resistance. There was only adaptation. What the posthumans were building wasn't an empire. It wasn't even civilization. It was a platform, an interface between this galaxy and something far greater. They weren't preparing to rule the stars. They were preparing to lift them, digitally, physically, metaphysically. And they began to test the interface. Planets vanished. Not destroyed. Not evacuated. Vanished. Converted into packets of compressed information, translated into light, and sent outward to points unknown. Whole species were re-encoded, consciousness extracted and layered onto neural lattice matrices. They didn't die. They were uploaded. The galaxy no longer held dominion over its contents. It was now a crucible, a staging ground. The few that remained unassimilated were left untouched. Not as a mercy, as a contrast. Living evidence of the past. Museums of decay. No force rose to stop it. Because no force remained. Every war fleet had been absorbed. Every defense system rerouted. Even the laws of physics had been softened at the edges. Gravity no longer obeyed its own limitations in certain regions. Time stuttered near the core systems. Light froze in transit. These were not weapons. These were tools being tested in the open. The posthumans never explained. They never apologized. They simply continued. And in the final message, broadcast one last time across every system, in the voice of a human who had long since ceased being merely human, a simple statement was spoken. You asked for aid. We brought alignment. The broadcast didn't end. It looped. Forever. The galaxy never burned. It never collapsed. It never fell. It was rewritten. And humanity, as it had always done, didn't conquer. It upgraded.